day of the 8th annual Thabo Mbeki Africa Day Lecture under the theme Africa and the Changing World. And indeed, the world has been changing. And we're doing it exactly a day after the actual day when the Organization of African Unity was established in 1963, when 70% of the people in the audience were not yet born. This event annually has become something we look forward to for the groundbreaking ideas on how to make the African Renaissance a reality. And today, with the kind of a caliber of scholar that we have, trying to make sense of what is happening around the world, promises to be an exciting feast of ideas. If I can get a signal that the people in the lines, we are told that the lines are rather long and we still have to observe all the security protocols and the accreditation, but we'll see how we can speed up that process. And whilst I check here, I'm sure that music for the interval, because I can't ask you on a Friday evening to sing, but that music, I'm sure they'll be able to keep us. I think in about 5 minutes we'll start. Yes, the lines are still very long, but we will start. Meantime, let me ask the head of Timali to come and say a word or two about this wonderful program they have. Professor Gumede. Let's put our hands together for Professor Gumede.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone. So I think as you can see here at the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, which has a number of programs. One of them is the Thabo Mbeki African Leadership Institute, The other one deals with democracy and education, SADET, and of course we've got the Presidential Library and a few other projects that I probably won't go into detail to here, because I'm here to talk about Timali. And of course, a lot of our students and alumni that's here know about what we do. The Thabo Mbeki Leadership Institute, which was started in 2010 by the former president, Thabo Mbeki, together with the University of South Africa as a partnership program focusing on training, mentoring, molding the thought leaders and the change agents that our continent desperately needs. As we all know that we have major challenges in our continent, challenges in relation to development, challenges regarding peace, security, and many other issues that I'm sure the professor who's giving a lecture today, Professor Mahmood Mamdani, is going to reflect upon. And of course, we register students, and it doesn't matter where you are. So you can register. If you're in South Africa, you come for contact sessions where you also get to interact with the former president himself, former President Thabo Mbeki. But also, if you are in another country, and we've had students, by the way, from all over the continent, and you'll be able to follow our courses no matter where you are. I think that's enough. We take students in 2 semesters, so we are opening the registration very soon for those that are able to register. And it's, of course, a very important issue because we do need thought leaders. The critical challenge that the continent faces amongst the many has to do with the deficit in relation to leadership, the leadership deficit. And that's what we try and deal with, particularly focusing on thought leadership. Thanks, Program Director.
Thank you very much. I looked around and I look at the number of dignitaries here, icons, veterans, and all kinds of leaders in our midst. That's why I won't even try to acknowledge anyone. That would actually be a suicidal exercise, because you hardly ever find such a concentration of eminent persons per square meter. So that in itself means this is a very important event indeed, at the time when not only South Africa but the whole world seem to be in a stir-fry situation with the kinds of developments which are taking place virtually everywhere. And at this moment, I think it is very important as we await our guests, who when they arrive will stand up just to show respect, and then we sit down thereafter. After the event, I've been asked to say that there are some refreshments. But now they said proceed to Philadelphia restaurant. Then I realized that this issue of changing the names of places is still a process that is ongoing, because Philadelphia. I mean, there are many Philadelphias. You could even mistake them for the other one. Unisa in the world was the first open distance education university, 1946. It therefore set the trend. Today it is one of the 10 mega universities in the world, which means big by any measure. Of course, the other day we met with even a bigger university, the Open University of China, which has a student enrollment of 3.2 million. That combines the population of Namibia and Lesotho. Even when you include the infants and the aged, you could register them 100%. And we are the largest in the Southern Hemisphere in terms of the numbers, the student enrollment. Our alumni base today is more than 700,000. Let me repeat, 700,000. We are the only university, as far as I know, that has signed an MOU with the African Union Commission. And the story is long. And I see AGs and former Amin Auditor generals here, and most of them will have studied here, one form or another. In the accounting program, 40% of South Africa's output comes from this institution. I think let's put our hands together for that. This year, for the first time, the person after whom this lecture is named will be walking in for the first time as the Chancellor of this university. Let's put our hands together. Our aspiration to be the African university, combined with a person who has been associated as the African Renaissance man, it's a perfect fit. And now I'm sure we will begin our program as I promised. Those who join us from the lines will just quietly do so. And I would also request that those who are helping them, ushering them in, will come and look at the open spaces so that we fill just those open spaces. And we will now be starting our program anytime soon. We won't be playing that wedding tune, you know, for people to come in. We'll just stand up and we go straight for the lecture. While still reflecting on this commercial break, I'm going to run out of facts now. That's my fear. You know, there is a story which says an Italian opera singer was always invited to every occasion to sing one song, I think it's Basta la Juba. On the 7th occasion, whenever there were events, he asked why they were always inviting him to sing this same tune. And the organizer came closer to his ears and said, "We want to sing it until you get it right." So sometimes there are moments like that. What must I say now? Because this may sound like service delivery failure. But we are in this great university ZK Matthews. If we can stand up and welcome our guests. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for such a warm welcome. Indeed, the 8th annual Thabo Mbeki Africa Day Lecture looks like an event like no other event. You may be seated. Without any waste of time, I'll now call upon our Vice-Chancellor and Principal, Professor Makanya, to come and give a word of welcome and opening remarks. Let's put our hands together.
Dr. Fugue, our Program Director, thank you so much for this opportunity. Dr. Fugue, by the way, is the advisor in the Office of the Vice-Chancellor and currently the Acting Executive Director of Marketing and Communication. The patron of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation and the former President of South Africa, His Excellency, President Thabo Mbeki. Chairperson of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, Dr. Regalia and all the members of the board of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, Mr. Sark, Chairperson of the Unisa Council, and all the Unisa Council members in attendance. And I also want to greet Mrs. Mallanna, members of our government at the level of national, provincial, and local government present, members of the diplomatic corps, our keynote speaker and eminent guest for the 8th Thabo Mbeki Africa Day Lecture, Professor Mahmood Mamdani, Mrs. Mundum, Mr. Max Bukwana, Chief Executive Officer of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation. I also want to mention that we have in our midst Professor Bani Bijana, the former Principal and Vice-Chancellor of Unisa, and Mrs. Dimza Bijana. But we also have in our midst the stalwart of our struggle, Ubabu Mlangeni, members of the Unisa Executive and Extended Management, members of the discussion panel, Dr. Edith Paswana, Dr. Sipokazi Magaja, but also our guest speaker in that midst, together with President Mbeki, our international guests, with special recognition of those from our continent, staff members of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, members of Unisa family, including staff, students, and alumni, leadership, staff, and students of the Thabo Mbeki African Leadership Institute, members of the judiciary, ecclesiastical community, business community, fellow institutions of higher learning, representatives of the civil society, the public sector, and the private sector, as well as the international donor community. We also have in our midst the leaders of our political parties and members of parliament, members of the media covering this historic event, distinguished audience in the ZK Matthews Great Hall at Unisa, and those viewing and listening to this Thabo Mbeki Africa Day lecture, good evening. A very warm welcome to you all. It is a signal honor and pleasure for the University of South Africa and the Thabo Mbeki Foundation to be hosting this 8th Thabo Mbeki Africa Day lecture in celebration of Africa Day, which was yesterday, 25 May, and Africa Month in 2017. It is always so rewarding to be in such esteemed and informed company and to experience both the atmosphere and the engagement that characterizes this much anticipated lecture. At the inaugural annual Thabo Mbeki lecture at the University of South Africa on 27 May 2010, President Mbeki, who is the patron of Timali, addressed the provocative question posed by the World Bank in 2000, that is, can Africa claim the 21st century? He proposed 6 practical steps that Africa must undertake if it is to claim the 21st century, asserting that the first step will be to build and nurture the native intellectual cadre committed to the transformation of Africa, as envisaged by leading African patriots and thinkers in the period spanning some 150 years. He said the following words, quote, "An urgent task in this regard is to rebuild and sustain our universities and other centers of learning, attract back to Africa intellectuals who have migrated to the developed North, build strong links with the intelligentsia in the African diaspora, and give them the time and space they need to help determine the future of Africa," unquote. And then at the official launch of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation and the Thabo Mbeki Africa Leadership Institute, during an international conference themed Investing in Thought Leaders for Africa's Renewal, held in Johannesburg from 11 to 13 October 2010, the retired Principal and Vice-Chancellor of Unisa, Professor Bani Pijana, stated the following, quote, "The partnership and collaboration between the Thabo Mbeki Foundation and the University of South Africa in the establishment of the Thabo Mbeki African Leadership Institute should marshal these intellectual forces and critical voices to Africa's betterment. This international conference should set an agenda that will draw Africa's intellectual resources, stimulate young Africans to become achievers, bristling in new ideas, and set the tone for a new positive indication for Africa that honors its past, engages the present, and shapes the future," unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, that is what we at Unisa are committed to doing. I thought it apposite to remind us this evening of the rationale for the establishment of Timali and for Unisa's commitment to partner with Timali in shaping futures, both in our country and on the continent, from a platform of critical and intellectual engagement and of training Africans for the political, economic, social, and cultural renewal of the African continent and its people. Timali is a vehicle for Africa's timely response to new developments which impact on the continent and which will also help to ensure that Africa's voice is heard in both the local and global contexts. This evening, we grow that tradition. That commitment, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, is more important than ever before. I'm sure you will agree with me that in the short space of 5 months, 2017 has provided us with an endless supply of global, continental, and national drama, intrigue, and conflict. From Brexit to Trumpism, reluctant or overzealous regime change on the continent, fake news, post-truth, and downright lies, to our own soap operas right here at home, where citizens go to sleep every evening knowing that they are likely to wake up to a new and confounding episode every morning. The time and need for straight talking, for clarity of thought, for rigorous and informed engagement and action has never been greater. And is as much as we acknowledge that our world, our continent, and our nation are in a state of flux, marching determinedly into a very opaque future, and that our citizens have never been so unsure and on edge as they are at this time in history. So we acknowledge that closer to home and to a growing extent on the continent, there are clarion calls and demands from an array of stakeholders for the urgent reclamation and reassertion of the African voice and identity as peers in global conversations and power relations. In fact, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, this is nothing new. W.E.B. Du Bois described his book, The World and Africa, published in 1947, and alluded to in the theme of this lecture as an inquiry into the part which Africa has played in world history. He was recasting a book he had published in 1939, and the new circumstance gave added significance to his insistence that Africa's part in world history was and will continue to be important. That new circumstance was described by Du Bois as follows, quote, Europe was in a catastrophic state. Colonial business as usual will not be resumed. Here was an opportunity for Africans to redefine their place in the world, unquote. But the main topic of his book was what Africa had brought to world history. 70 years later, we find ourselves here this evening expressing the very same sentiments. So perhaps a part of our conversations, of the work that needs to be done, is also to focus on why that is. Have we dropped or picked up that baton that was carried by the likes of W.E.B. Du Bois and other eminent Africa scholars? Are Du Bois' sentiments still relevant, or have they found new interpretation and meaning in a drastically changed world? We are particularly honored, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, to have as our keynote speaker this evening one of our most illustrious scholars and possibly one of the foremost experts and commentators on the works of W.B. Du Bois, Professor Mahmood Mamdani, whose voice I know has added some much needed gravitas and wisdom to many of the contestations and engagement that have taken place in our institutions of higher learning over the past 18 months or so. One has a sneaking suspicion, in fact, that Professor Mamdani has been quite invigorated by this evening's dynamic and that he has discovered a newfound enthusiasm and relevance for the work that he does, which has for too long has not been given the acknowledgement and status that it deserves. We are very pleased to be playing part in its resurgence. We are honored to have you, Professor Mamdani, as our keynote speaker this evening. I will leave it to our honorable patron and chancellor of Unisa to introduce you formally. I am certain that everyone here and those joining us from various viewpoints and listening posts will be enriched by your intellectual engagement. With these few words, please allow me to introduce His Excellency, our patron of Timali, and our Unisa Chancellor, President Thabo Mbeki, who will in turn introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Mahmood Mamdani. Our Chancellor does not need lengthy introductions. He in fact says he doesn't like them. He says that long introductions often sound like an obituary. We also know that he often questions the notion of a keynote speaker. So without delay, and given that what I've just highlighted, let me welcome the relentless champion of the African Renaissance, the patron of the Thabo Mbeki African Leadership Institute, and the chancellor of this august university, President Thabo Mbeki, to introduce Professor.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Vice-Chancellor, Professor Makanya. Professor Makanya has done the honors by acknowledging all of the important people who are here. so I won't repeat that, but thanks a lot, Professor, for doing that work for me. But I'm very glad to welcome everybody here to join Professor Makanya and welcoming you here today as we celebrate the Africa Day. Indeed, we decided on this day, today, Friday, for our mutual convenience, because normally we spend quite a bit of time here, and we thought that rather than meet on Thursday, when people then have to wake up the following day to go to work, it's better that we meet on Friday, so that even Bantu Olomisa, it doesn't have to go to Parliament. I recognize him. I recognize him because I'm afraid of being cooed. But a very special welcome to our distinguished lecturer, Professor Mahmood Mamdani. And indeed, I'm very, very glad that he readily agreed to be our distinguished lecturer this year. On March the 31st, March this year, Professor Mamdani delivered the Edward Said Memorial Lecture in London. We talked about it just now as we were coming here. And he began by quoting from the epic poem by Aimé Césaire, Notebook of a Return to the Native Land. And I'm sure all of you, as educated as you are in this hall, know that who Aimé Césaire was. From Martinique, born in Martinique, was a prominent Pan-Africanist. Let me quote an excerpt from that notebook, that poem, Notebook of a Return to the Native Land, which Professor Mamdani quoted in his lecture in London in March. And the poem says, I would arrive sleek and young in this land of mine, and I would say to this land whose loam is part of my flesh, I have wandered for a long time, and I'm coming back to the deserted hideousness of your swords. I would go to this land of mine, and I would say to it, embrace me without fear, and if all I can do is speak, it is for you I shall speak. And again I would say, my mouth shall be the mouth of those calamities that have no mouth. My voice, the freedom of those who break down in the prison holes of despair. And if all I know how to do is speak, it is for you that I shall speak. My lips shall speak for miseries that have no mouth. And on the way I would say to myself, and above all to my body as well as my soul, beware of assuming the sterile attitude of a spectator. For life is not a spectacle. A sea of miseries is not a proscenium. A man screaming is not a dancing bear. Unquote. Our distinguished lecturer, Professor Mamdani, is an outstanding public intellectual. Indeed, as Professor Makanya has just said, in my view, the leading public intellectual on our continent. And this is because he has said to himself, as did Aimé Césaire, that he would say to himself, and above all to my body as well as my soul, beware of assuming the sterile attitude of a spectator. For life is not a spectacle. A sea of miseries is not a mere part of the stage of a theater. Thus, we have with us today an eminent African intellectual who refuses to assume the sterile attitude of a spectator. And one example of the outcome of this refusal is what was entitled a separate opinion, which Professor Mamdani wrote as part of a member of the African Union Commission of Inquiry on South Sudan, expressed an opinion which was not shared by everybody on that commission. And he said what is popularly called an African solution is a contextual solution. The demand for an African solution arises from the experience of having been prescribed a series of single formula or one-size-fits-all remedies packaged as universal. He said in economic policy, the best-known single formula remedy was known as the Washington Consensus of the 1980s and 1990s, and was the result of efforts to address the problems of the debt crisis and global inequality. Its destructive effects are well documented. And today, that same single formula remedy rules the roost in the field of conflict resolution and transitional justice, prescribing a single across-the-board remedy, criminal accountability. And he said in addressing situations of extreme violence, they are now advocates of a similar one-size-fits-all approach, and this might seem appropriate. Justice, after all, like economics, is supposed to be based on universal principles. But there's a difference between following universal principles and adopting single formula solutions. And he said in the field of justice, the single formula approach makes a simple declaration. A crime has been committed, and the perpetrators must be identified and punished. The question of justice is reduced to an issue of crime and punishment, and those who see things in these terms will scan this report for a list of perpetrators to be investigated, tried, convicted, and punished. And he said context is not the opposite of universal value or standard. Context is an understanding that any concrete situation is an outcome of multiple causes: historical, political, moral, and economic. And the call for a contextual understanding is an argument that we need to move away from a single formula prescription to understand the precise interaction of multiple processes in the creation of a single event or outcome, unquote. And these are important and original observations which should serve as important reference material for all those who involve themselves in the important processes of resolving violent conflicts on our continent. And I'm certain that this evening, Professor Mamdani will leave us with new challenges as we continue to strive for Africa to take a rightful place in the context of the changing world he will speak about. A warm welcome, my dear friend. Both this university, Unisa, and the Thabo Mbeki Foundation feel privileged that you so willingly agreed to serve as our 2017 Africa Day lecturer. The year our country celebrates the centenary of the birth of yet another eminent African intellectual and revolutionary, the late Oliver Tambo. Welcome, Professor Mamdani, who has refused to assume the sterile attitude of a spectator. Thanks a lot.
The Chancellor, President Thabo Mbeki, the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Mallanna, ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to be invited to give this lecture, and I hope I can do justice to it. When formulating the title for this lecture, I had in mind Du Bois's book of nearly a century ago, Africa and the World. In Africa and the World, Du Bois took a historical perspective. His focus was on Africa's contribution to the making of the modern world. My purpose is to look at the present and the future from the vantage point of the all-important question raised by the South African student movement over the past year, decolonization. In today's talk, I propose to look at the modern period through the lens of globalization and decolonization. The first globalization was associated with the rise of Western power in the centuries that followed 1492. These centuries led to the colonization of the three continents, the Americas, Africa, and Asia. We can trace the beginnings of the second globalization to the era of revolutions that began with the Russian Revolution and continued with the great revolutions in China, Cuba, Algeria, and Vietnam. Though each claimed the mantle of socialism, I think these developments are better recognized as high points of a decolonizing global movement which paved the way for political independence in the colonies. If the first globalization was a colonizing movement, the second globalization can be said to represent its antithesis, decolonization. If colonialism and anti-colonialism can be summed up as two contradictory forms of globalization, one anchored in the West and the other outside it, this simplified understanding of modern history is considerably complicated by recent developments. I'm referring to Brexit and the election of Donald Trump as President of the US. While both have been understood as expressions of popular mobilizations against globalization, I will argue that both need to be understood in a narrower sense, as mobilizations against the neoliberal face of globalization. Both represented a stunning reversal in the institutionalized practice of politics, politics as a profession, as known in the West. No sector of the establishment, neither political parties nor established media of the right, left, or center had the slightest inkling of what was around the corner. Few academic pundits could claim to be ahead of the curve. Both Brexit and the US election represent the most remarkable rupture between machine politics and popular politics. Populism has come to the West. How should Africa understand this shift? Let me begin with President Trump. We all know that Clinton won the popular vote and Trump the vote in the Electoral College. So in what sense was this result a popular outcome? Imagine what would have happened if the result had been the reverse. If Clinton had won the Electoral College and Trump the popular vote by over 2 million, and Clinton had been declared winner in the election. My guess is that Trump supporters would have been on the streets, the way Clinton supporters were not. Why? Because Clinton had a machine, and Trump's candidacy was propelled forward by a movement. Because Clinton promised a continuation of the status quo, and Trump a change of sorts. Liberal Democrats were shocked by the result. Some were so dazed, you would think this had been a second 9/11. It was, after all, 11/9. Who voted for Trump and why? Were they a racist, sexist, misogynist, homophobic lot? A basket of deplorables, in Clinton's unfortunate phrase? Or were they mobilized around real issues to which liberal Democrats had no answers? Maybe why these issues never figured in the campaign. Even if Trump seems increasingly cornered by the deep state and seems to be looking for favor with the liberal establishment by beating drums of war, even if Trump should fall in the coming months or year, these issues will not go away. I have in mind 2 issues: immigration and war as a crusade for human rights. Both are key to the definition of the neoliberal phase of contemporary globalization. We know that historically borders have been of concern mainly to business. Borders signified the outlines of a home market capitalists needed to control. What we have been slow to realize is that borders are of increasing significance for working people. In the era of national sovereignty and national citizenship, I've been wired up, so I really don't know. This is not my normal state of affairs. What we have been slow to realize is that borders are of increasing significance for working people. In the era of national sovereignty and national citizenship, every advance in the minimum wage and in social benefits is an advance limited to citizens and permanent residents. No one thinks of these as part of human rights. This is why unlimited or lax immigration has come to be seen as undermining historically gained wage levels and social rights. Immigration, especially of the unskilled and the poor, has become a code word for the entry of cheap labor. Thus, the new situation: business can be pro-immigration and workers can be anti-immigration. Does the left have an immigration policy that addresses these concerns? In both South Africa and the US, it is assumed that anti-immigration is evidence of a xenophobic society restrained by a state focused on rights. I would like to suggest that we consider the opposite hypothesis. It is the state that has been sanctioning xenophobia. As Marx wrote in the 18th Brumaire, if you play fiddle at the top of the state, you should not be surprised that those down below dance. In South Africa, the official definition of an immigrant until 1991 was that he or she had to be able to assimilate into the white population. By definition, black people from the rest of Africa were not immigrants, but temporary guests, contract laborers. The entire region, as you well know, was a pool of potential cheap labor for South African mines, farms, and industry. Most adults in surrounding countries in the region have been to South Africa at least once. Many have been recycled several times over. A 2006 study showed that 81% of Lesotho's adult population had been to South Africa at some point in their lives. Comparable figures for Mozambique and Zimbabwe were 29% and 23%. What happened if they overstayed or entered illegally? The apartheid state channeled unauthorized immigrants to commercial farms by offering them the option of working on these farms or being deported. When it comes to anti-apartheid mobilizations, migrants have been critical, from Clemens Kadali in ICU in the pre-apartheid period to many in Fossatu in the 1970s. I am not sure how many non-citizen migrants voted in the 1994 election, but I believe they were a significant force in Fossatu. After 1994, the modus operandi was to deport these persons. By 2006, South Africa had deported 1.7 million undocumented migrants to neighboring states like Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Lesotho. In 2008-09 alone, 280,837 migrants were arrested and deported. A new Immigration Act was signed into law in late 2002. Though it blamed xenophobia on South African society and claimed to reverse it, the Act introduced community policing of undocumented migrants. In plain words, the state invited South Africans to spy on neighbors and strangers and report their suspicions to the authorities. When the first xenophobic riots against those derogatorily known as the Makerere took place in April 2015, the government response included arresting 1,650 illegal immigrants in the very next month. When it comes to the US, we identify anti-immigration policy with popular xenophobia mobilized around the demand for the wall that Trump promised to build on the Mexico-US border. But as many have pointed out, this wall had already been built since Bill Clinton as a bipartisan enterprise, complete with advanced sensors, cameras, drones, biometrics, spy towers, radar systems, much of the technology tested in America's distant battlefields, as well as actual walls. The turning point was the draconian Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act of 1996, passed under Bill Clinton. The act expanded the Border Patrol, criminalized numerous types of low-level immigration violations, and facilitated and expanded deportation procedures. In its wake, convictions of just about any sort, including the most minor crimes, became grounds for deportation, even retroactively. Even early violations that had resulted in probation and community service or a small fine became evidence of an immigrant's criminal status, from which deportation naturally followed. This is the era during which broken windows and stop and frisk strategies were introduced. The claim was that mass arrests for low-level offenses would prevent more serious crime. But all it did was to explode federal rosters of criminal immigrants. The second big turning point came in the Obama years, which introduced an even more aggressive policing of communities of color, along with mass criminalization of those deported across the border. Instead of being escorted across the border, which had been the previous policy, those apprehended were arrested, fingerprinted, in other words, criminalized, and then formally deported. Keep in mind that the number of undocumented immigrants to the US has been in steady decline since 2008. Immigrant crime rates are lower than citizen crime rates, and even the numbers apprehended at the border and sent back to Mexico are beginning to fall. Yet, the numbers criminalized and formally deported across the border have skyrocketed. Immigration crimes came to rival drug crimes in the federal court system. Obama became known as the deporter-in-chief, not because he deported more people than previous administrations, but because he criminalized more of those he deported. American individualism has always seen poverty as a sign of failure, but American liberalism has reversed the premise of the war on poverty to wage a war on the poor, on the premise that the poor breed crime, and the prevention of crime requires that the poor be individually policed and criminalized for the smallest infraction. If the war on the poor, including the war on drugs, of which I shall have more to say, is the internal face of neoliberalism, its external face is the export of the criminal justice system overseas under the guise of promoting human rights. At the end of the Second World War, Eleanor Roosevelt hoped that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights may well become the international Magna Carta for all men everywhere. In 2015, the human rights community celebrated the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta, which curtailed the power of the king. 1215, wrote the FT columnist Edward Luce, is today seen as the year zero of liberal democracy. At first, the soft side of liberal cosmopolitanism, human rights have come to be the hard sell of a war policy justified as human rights interventionism. The first mainstream challenge to the theory of human rights as a secular rationale for human rights interventionism came with the Trump campaign. The Trump campaign did not oppose war, but it did oppose human rights interventions as waging war to spread our values. According to Trump, only interests, not values, should justify war. In saying so, Trump did all of us a great service. He lifted the veil and unmasked America's war machine as a self-serving juggernaut. Listen to Trump's words earlier this week as he called for the formation of an Arab NATO to confront Iran. Quote, "We are not here to lecture. We are not here to tell other people how to live, what to do, who to be, or how to worship. Instead, we are here to offer partnership based on shared interests and values to pursue a better future for us all." The reference to values is still there, but it takes second place to interests. To underline these shared interests, Trump announced $110 billion in arms sales to Saudi Arabia, as well as billions of dollars worth of business deals. Trump is no peace candidate. In his first 100 days, he embraced war with glee, whether in dropping the mother of all bombs in Afghanistan or in unleashing a volley of cruise missiles on Syria. Liberals, from newspaper columnists to senators and allied ambassadors, were united in their approval, hoping that President Donald Trump's actions signal that the world's policeman is back on the beat. We are used to thinking of liberalism and democracy as twins, as in liberal democracy. But we may now need to think of the two terms separately: liberal cosmopolitanism and popular democracy. Liberal cosmopolitanism has turned into a language of empire, including a refusal to accept the results of a democratic process whose rules, however unsatisfactory, have been agreed upon. I give you two examples. The first is the election of in the Palestinian territories. Hamas won the election, but liberal cosmopolitans refused to accept the result. The second example is that of the election in Egypt. Muslim Brothers won, but the same forces supported a military coup against the elected government. The third example may be unfolding before our very eyes in the US. We may be at a historical turning point where liberalism and democracy are parting ways. Why is democratic liberalism in crisis? Did Trump and his counterparts in the West, the leaders of Brexit, and Marine Le Pen in France, did they cause it? Or is it the dying gasp of America's white majority, as many have suggested? There is no denying the race question in America. As Malcolm X pointed out long ago, if whites lived the promise of the American dream, black people had been inmates of the American nightmare. The dilemma is framed graphically in a new book by the civil rights litigator and legal scholar, Michelle Alexander, titled The New Jim Crow. Alexander's focus is the American prison populations. These have multiplied sevenfold since the mid-1970s, while the country's population has increased by only 50%. Though America is home to only about 1/20th of the world's population, it houses almost a quarter of the world's prisoners, and most of these prisoners are black. The example of punishment for the use of cocaine suggests that this has to do more with color than crime. Cocaine comes in two forms: the more affordable crack version, which is widespread in the inner cities, and the more expensive powdered version, more common in rich suburbs. Could this have anything to do with the fact that sentences for those consuming the crack version are 100 times more than sentences for those caught with powdered version? Even after recent reforms, the difference is 18-1. The result is that a disproportionate number of inner city cocaine users are charged with a felony and sentenced to long-time prison terms, whereas the suburban users of cocaine are more likely charged with a misdemeanor. As a result, though whites are more likely to commit drug crimes than people of color, blacks are more likely to be imprisoned for it. If present trends continue, Alexander says the US will imprison 1/3 of its African American population. It is not as if crime rates in the US are any higher than in other Western countries. They are not. Yet the rates of incarceration in the US have soared compared to the same countries. The US embarked on an unprecedented expansion of its juvenile detention and prison systems in the Clinton era. During the past 3 decades, the US prison population has exploded from 300,000 to more than 2 million in 30 years, with the majority of the increase due to drug convictions. Alexander says the African American community is divided between a privileged minority that has benefited from affirmative action. In South Africa, you call it black empowerment, and young black men who are under active control of the criminal justice system. Those currently in prison, on parole, or on probation total approximately 1/3 of the young black men in the US. Put it differently, nearly 1/3 of black men are likely to spend time in prison during their lifetimes. But more importantly, when they come out of prison, they will be second-class citizens without the right to vote. In contrast, America has been dubbed a land of opportunity for white workers. Until the beginning of the Reagan era, white working-class families could realistically look to a decent future, one in which their children may hope to get a college degree and with it a white-collar job. No longer, though. White workers have been among the immediate and most visible victims of globalization. Why did almost a quarter of America's white working class, who voted for Barack Obama in 2008, switch to Trump in 2016? Had they suddenly turned into a basket full of deplorables, in Hillary Clinton's unfortunate phrase? Or did this dramatic turn have something to do with the fact that in the aftermath of the economic crisis of 2008, they found themselves as part of America's bottom 50% who own only 1% of the country's wealth? Whereas there's a growing feeling in the West that the criminal justice system may be the cause of growing crime, violence, and incarceration, and not the solution to it, the criminal justice regime has over the past few decades been exported to the rest of the world as part of a program to promote human rights. Indeed, criminal justice, the hunt for perpetrators who are jailed, tried, and if convicted, incarcerated and politically disenfranchised, is touted as the solution for growing internal violence in Africa. I am sure it has not escaped your attention that the South African NGO and human rights community has been in the forefront of those supporting human rights interventions, particularly on this continent. I would like to think that they are doing so out of ignorance, even if with good intention, but without a knowledge of conditions that drive this violence. I hope this means they are open to a discussion of the causes of political violence and the consequences of using armies and courts as so many antidotes to it. I will save this discussion for a later time. For the time I have today, I propose to discuss the question raised by the South African student movement, that of decolonizing the university. Let me share the outlines of my argument before I discuss it in detail. The contemporary African university began as a colonial project. It was a top-down modernist project with the ambition to transform society. In that sense, the contemporary university was the precursor, the first edition of the one-size-fits-all prescription that we associate with structural adjustment programs designed by the IMF and the World Bank in the 1980s. Its ambition was to create universal scholars, men and women who are the embodiment of the achievements of Western civilization, who stand for excellence regardless of context. They would be at home anywhere in the modern world. The first critical reflection on this project took place in the nationalist movement, the movement which gelled around a critique of the colonial project and the colonial vision. From the ranks of the nationalist movement emerged a different kind of intellectual, the public intellectual. If the hallmark of the global scholar was excellence, that of the public intellectual was relevance. Excellence had to be measured without regard to context. Relevance was necessarily contextual. The important point, however, is that neither the global scholar nor the public intellectual has stood the test of time. Our challenge today is not to choose between them, but to figure out how to respond to the division between them. That is at the heart of the question of decolonizing higher education. Let me elaborate my argument. What does it mean to decolonize a university, an authorized center of knowledge production? In one form or another, this question has been at the center of discussions in African universities in the period after independence. Most writings on the African university begin with a list of pre-modern institutions as precursors to the modern African university. If you go to the UNESCO website, you will see references to these venerable institutions from the pre-colonial and the pre-modern period. The Alexandria Museum and Library, Al-Azhar in Cairo, Al-Zaytuniya in Tunis, Al-Qarawin in Fez, Sankore in Timbuktu, and so on. My first point is that these sites can be misleading. Neither the institutional form nor the curricular content of the contemporary African university derives from the pre-colonial institutions. They derive from the colonial model. The colonial model was a discipline-based, gated community with a distinction between clearly defined groups, administrators, academics, and fee-paying students. Its birthplace was the University of Humboldt in Berlin, designated as part of a project of national rejuvenation in the aftermath of the French defeat of Germany in 1810. Over the next century, this innovation spread to much of Europe and from there to the rest of the world. Both the institutional form of the university and the body of intellectual traditions that have shaped modern social sciences and humanities are a product of the Enlightenment experience in Europe. That is why it makes sense to speak of the advent of the modern university in Africa only with the advent of the colonial period, and to locate the struggle to reform it as part of a larger endeavor we know as decolonization. In what follows, I shall focus on Makerere University, Dar es Salaam, University of Dar es Salaam, and Kodesria as three different sites from which have come initiatives to decolonize higher education. I do not offer these narratives for a romantic celebration, but in the hope that today's student movement will engage with this legacy critically. The reform movement of the 60s unfolded at two very different campuses. Makerere University, established in 1922, was the paradigmatic colonial university. The University of Dar es Salaam, established at independence in 1963, emerged as the flag bearer of anti-colonial nationalism. The two universities stood for two contrasting projects. The Colonial University as the turf of the universal scholar, and the Nationalist University as the home of the public intellectual. These contrasting visions were articulated by two different academics, Ali Mazrui at Makerere and Walter Rodney in Dar es Salaam. Mazrui called for a university true to its classical vision, as the home of the scholar, quote, fascinated by ideas. Rodney saw the university as the home of the public intellectual, a committed intellectual located in his or her time and place and deeply engaged with the wider society. These contrasting visions were anchored in two equally one-sided notions of higher education, one accenting excellence, the other relevance. The debate between the two unfolded in public contests in Dar and Makerere and within the pages of the magazine Transition. In an article in Transition titled Tanzaphilia, a Diagnosis, Mazrui chided his left critics for having gone through no more than a surface conversion to radicalism. Mazrui defined Tanzaphilia as a political phenomenon, an opium of the Afrophiles, the romantic spell which Tanzania casts on so many of those who have been closely associated with her, a condition particularly marked among Western intellectuals. Mazrui chided left intellectuals, liberals and socialists, expatriates and locals, seduced by the language of socialism and caught in the drift to single-party rule, they had come to approach power with timidity and soft hands. I quote again, "Many of the most prosaic Western pragmatists have been known to acquire that dreamy look under the spell of Tanzania." Mazrui had his eye on simple facts like the Committee of Nine at the University of Dar es Salaam, which he termed the super left. Citing the pressure from this super left to turn the University of Dar es Salaam into an ideological college, Mazrui suggested that the genuine university should not be monopolistic. He argued that the university should be multi-ideological rather than uni-ideological, permitting maximum interplay between different interpretations of reality. But Mazrui was not just taking a polemical swipe at his ideological opponents. His argument in Tanzaphilia is more profound. The focus is on the epistemological and not just the ideological basis of the political condition he calls Tanzaphilia. Mazrui begins by distinguishing ideological orientation from mode of reasoning. For a start, ideological orientation is both superficial and changeable when compared to intellectual acculturation. To be in favor of this country or that, to be attracted by this system of values rather than that, all are forms of ideological conversion. And under a strong impulse, one can change one's creed. But it is much more difficult to change the process of reasoning which one acquires from one's total educational background. It is intellectual acculturation rather than ideological orientation that binds a Western liberal and a Western radical in an almost indissoluble bond. No amount of radicalism in a Western-trained person can eliminate the Western style of analysis which he acquires. After all, French Marxists are still French in their intellectual style. Ideologically, they may have a lot in common with Communist Chinese or Communist North Koreans, but in style of reasoning and the idiom of his thought, a French Marxist has more in common with a French liberal than with fellow communists in China and Korea. And that is why a French intellectual who is a Marxist can more easily cease to be a Marxist than he can cease to be a French intellectual. To bring the point home, Mazrui distinguished between a pro-Western attitude and a Western mode of thinking. Applying this to Julius Nyerere, Mazrui argued, we find that someone like him can more easily cease to be pro-Western than he can cease to be Westernized in his basic intellectual style and mental processes. And it is the latter quality which has often captivated Afrophile Western intellectuals. It is worth reflecting on Mazrui's distinction between ideological orientation and mode of reasoning. Was Mazrui implying that his interlocutors from the left needed to go beyond a cosmetic to an epistemological shift? This is the context in which a series of memorable debates were held, first at Makerere, then at Dar es Salaam, between Walter Rodney and Ali Mazrui. Rodney called on intellectuals to join the struggle to consolidate national independence in an era when, though colonialism had ended, imperialism reigned supreme. If Rodney focused on the outside of nationalism, Mazrui called attention to its inside. If Rodney called on intellectuals to rally around the need to consolidate national independence and thereby realize the unfinished agenda of anti-colonialism, Mazrui called attention to the authoritarian tendencies of nationalism in power. The debate between the two mirrored larger societal processes, the tension between nationalism and democracy, and a sharpening contest between state and society. It also reflected a growing tension within the academy between the nationalist public intellectual and the universalist scholar. It is in this context that Mazrui emerged as the first critic of nationalism from the standpoint of democracy. I want to go on to the question of disciplines and interdisciplinarity. If Makerere of the 1960s was the first site of engagement with the question of decolonization, the second site was the University of Dar es Salaam in the 1970s. There, the debate on decolonization focused on disciplinarity. The Dar discussion unfolded in the context of rapid political change, triggered by a student demonstration on 22nd October 1966, protesting a government decision to introduce compulsory national service for all secondary school graduates. Claiming that the original decision was necessary to prepare educated youth for service to the nation, and charging the youth with elitism, government sent home all 334 demonstrating students and canceled their bursaries. In another few months, on 5th February 1967, President Julius Nyerere issued a clarion call for a change of state policy, known as the Arusha Declaration. There followed a program of nationalization, the centerpiece of an official call for socialism. In response, the university organized a conference on the role of University College Dar es Salaam in a socialist Tanzania, held from 11th to 13th of March, 1967. The conference ended with a call for relevance, noting that various disciplines and related subjects are not studied in the context of East Africa's and particularly Tanzania's socio-economic development aspirations, concerns, and problems. Among the recommendations was one for a continuous curriculum review. The conference triggered vigorous debates amongst both academic staff and students on campus. Accounts of these discussions identify three different points of view. Radicals, mostly expatriates, wanted a complete transformation of both curriculum and administrative structure. Above all, they wanted to abolish discipline-based departments. Moderates, who were the majority and included most Tanzanian members of staff, agreed that there should be a radical review of the curriculum, but did not agree that departments should be abolished. Conservatives resisted any change. The reform that followed aimed to replace disciplinary departments with interdisciplinary programs throughout the university. Perhaps the most acute critique of this initiative came from a subcommittee of the University Council, appointed in November 1970 to review the program. The subcommittee went on to question the wisdom of a one-sided emphasis on interdisciplinarity. Would not interdisciplinarity lead to a focus on solving the problem rather than on understanding the method? And would not a problem-solving focus likely undermine the scholarly content of higher education, producing technocrats rather than reasoning graduates? This is the question the subcommittee asked. The reform process at the University of Dar es Salaam was sustained over years for one main reason. The process was not confined within the walls of the formal university structures and organs, nor was it just the result of reforms introduced from above. If the impetus was the Arusha Declaration, the process drew sustenance from initiatives outside formal structures of the university, whether the classroom, the faculty board, or the university senate. The lesson is clear. Without a mass student movement and an academic movement pushing for reform, reforms will be no more than cosmetic. The movement in Dar was modest, but its impact was real. Student activists mobilized around two key publications, Cheche and Maji Maji. These are Kiswahili words. Cheche means spark, after Lenin's spark, and Maji Maji was the first major resistance against the Germans in the 1920s. Informal initiatives came from reform-minded academic staff and students who came together in discussion groups. Two in particular deserve mention. The first was known as the ideological class and deliberately met 10 a.m. every Sunday. Its stated aim was to provide students with an alternative to church attendance. The second comprised a range of after-class study groups that proliferated over the years. In 1975, I recall belonging to 6 study groups, each with between 2 and 8 members. We met once a week, and each group required background reading of 100 pages. So 600 pages a week. This was a period of tremendous intellectual ferment, marked by 2 different trajectories, each set in motion by a different work. The first, written in the mode of dependency theory, was Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and was very much in line with the mode of reasoning in the Arusha Declaration. The second contrasted with the language and promise of the Arusha Declaration. It contrasted the language and promise of the Arusha Declaration with the reality of internal social and political developments in the country. 2 books, authored by Isa Shivji, The Silent Class Struggle and Class Struggles in Tanzania, reflected the accent on internal processes. The publication of Shivji's books triggered a debate among academics at Dar. That debate focused on imperialism and the state. If Ali Mazrui was the first major liberal intellectual critic of nationalism and power, Isa Shivji was its first major intellectual critic from the left. The third site for reform was Codesria. Begun with donor encouragement and funding in 1973 as a council of directors of institutes of economic and social research in Africa, Codesria had over the years transformed itself into a council for the development of social research in Africa. Codesria was organized as a series of symposia, conferences, alongside small panels, large audiences, but it lent itself to public debates around issues of public interest. It was a ready-made forum for public intellectuals. At the same time, a variety of other forums, multinational research groups, national working groups, small grants programs for doctoral research, provided space to nurture young scholars. No great books were written under the umbrella or sponsorship of Codesria. Instead, scholars who wrote important works, Samir Amin, Achi Mafeje, Claude Ake, Tandika Mkandewire, Ifeoma Diume, Isa Shivji, Sam Moyo, Wamba Diawamba, turned to Codesria to initiate debates that would change public discourse on the continent. Such, for example, was the impact of debates on dependency and development, on social movements and democracy, and later on gender and historical writing. The Codesria vision became the subject of a widespread debate in the 1990s with the appointment of a new executive secretary. The clash echoed the old and familiar divide between global scholars and public intellectuals. As the debate heated up, the two sides gave or called each other names: globalists and Pan-Africanists. Globalists criticized Codesria's preference for the large symposium and for conferences which they said had politicized intellectual work and tailored scholarship to meet the demands of regionally focused public debate and discussion. Pan-Africanists called for a defense of Codesria as an all-African institution, a protected space for forging an Africa-wide research, intellectual, and political agenda. Codesria developed as a non-disciplinary space where all took leave of disciplinary specializations and stood on a non-disciplinary turf. Focused on addressing public issues, it took theory for granted. The theory it took for granted was political economy. The more political economy emerged as the master discipline in the academy, the more it became clear that though it had an ideological critique of what Claude Ake and Dani Nabudere called bourgeois social science, political economy shared common intellectual ground with the object of its critique. That common ground was the singular notion of the human, except this time the human was an economic man. The hegemony of political economy was inscribed in most new and innovative departures in the post-colonial academy. The core of the interdisciplinary program called Development Studies at the University of Dar es Salaam was political economy. Even the Dar es Salaam School of History was known for a perspective anchored in political economy. And above all, Codesria was home of radical scholars who swore by political economy, sometimes as an oath of loyalty. The public intellectual and the scholar are not two different persona, but two distinct perspectives, even preoccupations. One draws inspiration from the world of scholarship, the other from that of public debate. The distinction between them is not hard and fast, since the boundary shifts over time and is blurred at any one point in time. Tensions between the two perspectives were evident in the early post-independence period. If the public intellectual hoped to work with local communities as close to the ground as possible, the scholar had universalist aspirations based on the claim that a universal intellectual trades a global ware, theory. The split between the two was often pregnant with political significance. If the public intellectual took sides as a proud partisan, the scholar claimed objectivity as an observer, a Hegelian witness, an owl of Minerva, whose wisdom can only come in the wake of events to which the disinterested intellectual must relate as a witness rather than as a partisan. We need to acknowledge that the gulf between the scholar and the public intellectual is minimal in the West and maximal outside the West. This is for one reason. The theory that valorizes the scholar is abstracted from the Western experience. Even though theorists claim universality, theory has a history. And that is the history of the West. This is true of Marx and Foucault as it is true of lesser names. This means that in spite of pretensions to universality, the scholar in the modern economy, in the modern academy, is basically a Western scholar. It should not be surprising that Western theory resonates more in the Western context than outside it. In the half-century since independence in this part of the world, the dialectic between the public intellectual and the scholar has gone through a number of significant shifts. The first big shift took place with independence. Few at the time realized how radically both the perspective and the role of the public intellectual would change in a post-colonial setting. The role of the public intellectual in a colonial university was relatively unambiguous. The public intellectual found a secure home in the ranks of the nationalist movement. But nationalists in power had little patience with domestic critics, especially if those crossed the language barrier between the gown and the town in the countryside, and tried to link up with social movements. This introduced a tension among radical intellectuals still on campus and yesterday's comrades now in power. From allies in a broad camp, they turned into adversaries. The second big shift is taking place now on the heels of the development of an expanded NGO movement. Most NGOs have been retooled to act as so many whistleblowers who must ensure the accountability and transparency of the government in power, but without combining it with a search for an alternative order. If NGOs act as so many sentries for the neoliberal order, the new public intellectuals are expected to shed the politically partisan character of the old public intellectual and function as so many in-house advisors to governments of the day. Though advising government, they don the cloak of expertise and claim to be untainted by politics. Yet the consequence is to harness would-be scholars to a political agenda that would quarantine the nationalist project. The underlying assumption is that politics inevitably introduces a bias, whether national or sectarian, and is thus a negative influence on the formulation and implementation of policy. The ground is shifting as international donors seek to reshape the African Academy and its relationship to society and the state. In this new context, the public intellectual is being retooled as an advisor and a consultant. Not the university, but the think tank is emerging as the new home for the refashioned public intellectual in the neoliberal era. The effect is both to depoliticize the public intellectual and to hitch his and her labor to an official agenda. It is worth relating this development to one particular debate on institutional reform, that on disciplinarity and interdisciplinarity, which took place at the University of Dar es Salaam in the 60s. Given that theory has been produced in disciplinary contexts in the modern university, the location and orientation of the global scholar is likely to be disciplinary. In contrast, the public intellectual is likely to gravitate to the problem-solving approach characteristic of multidisciplinary teams. This should focus our attention or this should refocus our attention on the question raised by the University of Dar es Salaam Council Subcommittee. Would not a problem-solving approach likely produce technocrats, reducing the scholarly content of higher education? This should help us understand an otherwise inexplicable development, the downward slide of the public intellectual from political partisans to apolitical expert in a matter of a few decades. Before we romanticize interdisciplinarity in a one-sided way, I suggest we keep in mind a few facts. One is that all World Bank teams are interdisciplinary. Second is the organization of knowledge in the apartheid university. One of my first discoveries as the director of the Center of African Studies at UCT in 1996 was that the disciplines studied the white experience, and the interdisciplinary space known as African Studies focused on the native experience. The disciplines were oriented to theory. African Studies was oriented to gathering facts. Unlike in the 1960s and 70s, the public intellectual of the early 21st century cannot be presumed to be a progressive intellectual. In this era, the definition of the public has changed. It is no longer just the people, the governed. It also includes the government, the donor, and the financial institutions on which governments increasingly depend. The public intellectual based in a think tank is expected to serve the government above all as the guarantor of evidence-based policies. The new type of public intellectual is recruited and funded by development partners to monitor public institutions, both from within and from without, as it were, round the clock, in the name of accountability. The combination of accountability and transparency in turn ensures the monitoring of this new type of public intellectual by development partners who fund the exercise. Let me come to a close. If the tension between the public intellectual and the scholar informed the public role of the intellectual as a social critic, another tension between disciplinarity and non- or multi- or anti-disciplinarity informed the role of the scholar as a producer of knowledge. In a colonial context, these tensions reflected a wider divide between one who produces theory and the one who applies it. Colonialism brought not only theory from the Western academy, but also the assumption that theory is produced in the West, and the aim of academy outside the West is to apply that theory. Its implication was radical. If the making of theory was a truly creative act in the West, its application in the colonies became the reverse, a turnkey project that did no more than operationalize theory. This was true on the left as well as on the right, whether students' effort was going into the study of Marx and Foucault or of Weber and Huntington. One student after another learned theory as if learning a new language. Some remarkably well, others not so well. As they stuttered in translation, these others give us an idea of what is wrong with the notion that to be a student is to be a technician, learning to apply a theory produced elsewhere. We risk producing a high-cost caricature, yet another group of mimic men and women for a globalized era. The alternative is to rethink our aspiration, not just to import theory from outside as another turnkey developmentalist project, but to aim differently and not just higher, to theorize our own reality. From this point of view, theory may travel, but not under the banner of universality. If theory is abstracted from particular experiences in different parts of the world, then traveling theory should make possible not only a translation, but also a comparison, and based on it, a process of learning and adaptation. A globalized world may be one world, as the ad says, but oneness is not sameness. We must not only learn to stand on our feet, but also to think using our heads. That means to theorize our own reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Quite profound, incisive, enlightening. Oneness is not sameness. Now I will be inviting Dr. Edith Paswana, who will facilitate the panel reflection. And she will also invite the members of the panel. Can we put our hands together, please?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening to the listeners and viewers back at home, and to the audience in the auditorium here this evening. Just a few seconds as I try to check my introduction, the biography. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Fikeni, for your generous introduction. And let me start by thanking the organizers for asking me to facilitate this discussion this evening in this historic event in celebration of the 8th Africa Day lecture under the theme, Africa and the Changing World. Our panelists, tonight we are going to have a very distinguished panel, as one of them is already here, Professor, our own, very own distinguished Pan-Africanist scholar in the diaspora, Mahmood Mamdani from Columbia University. I think he has already been introduced. Our second speaker will be His Excellency, former President Thabo Mbeki, the patron of Thabo Mbeki Foundation and the current Chancellor of Unisa. I will invite him to come to the front. The third panelist will be our very own local and sister, Dr. Siphokazi Magadla, who is a lecturer in the Political and International Studies Department at Rhodes University since 2011. She worked previously as a research consultant for the Security Sector Governance Program of the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria, focusing on the role of women in peace and security. She holds a master's degree in international affairs from Ohio University in the US. She is a Fulbright scholar. She graduated with a PhD in April 2017. She's a new PhD. Hands for that. Thank you. The title of her PhD study is Demobilization and the Civilian Reintegration of Women Ex-Combatants in Post-Apartheid South Africa, the Aftermath of Transnational Guerrilla Girls, Combative Murders, and In-Betweeners in the Shadows of a Late-Century War. The study is based on life history interviews conducted with women who fought for Umkhonto weSizwe, MK, which is also known as MK, Azanian People's Liberation Army, APLA, and Amabuto Self-Defense Unit. The thesis builds on Jacqueline Koch's 1991 pioneering study on war and gender in South Africa. It is the first study that exclusively focuses on women's ex-combatants' experience in post-apartheid South Africa. She was a fellow of the Social Science Research Council's Next Generation Social Sciences in Africa Fellowship Program in 2013 to 2014, which provided the funding for her doctoral research. She is the current book reviewer, editor of the Journal of Contemporary African Studies, JCAS. Welcome, my sister. Come to the front. A very warm welcome, a very warm round of applause for our panelists, please, again. And as is custom here, Professor Mamdani, after the lecture, we don't really want to undermine the lecture by going back to discuss it or ask discussants to talk about your lecture. We provide this space in such a way that we allow the audience here to interact with our panelists here, because really this time is for our audience. And therefore, as you have already picked on, I think you have just provided us with a very provocative lecture. You painted the medley of crises in the world that we live in today. And I think we could not have thought of any other person other than you to come and do this lecture tonight, particularly because of your background in political science. You are an academic, and as a result, you were able to take us through from global politics and into the universities as well. And so, before I open the floor for our audience to come and interact with us, here, I want my sister here, Sipokazi, to just reflect and give comments based on your role as an international relations scholar, also as your role as an young African woman living in Africa today and seeing all these changes. I think Professor Mamdani has already, he tried to revisit W.E.B. Du Bois' book on the world and Africa and the world, and as a result, he has been able to provide us with a lot of information, in a short space of time, but it really paints what is going on, and particularly with what is happening here at home with regard to decolonization. So I'll give you to open the floor by giving your own reflections on this.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Paswana. Thank you, Prof. Mamdani. I'm very thankful to be part of this conversation. Prof. Mamdani has given us a lot to think through and to begin to think about this moment where it seems that the nature of American power is shifting, and I think what the lecture allows us to do is to pause as Africans and not react in terms of the anxieties of those who are not concerned, who are only concerned about the power seemingly shifting to another continent. And how do we focus this moment in terms of theory, in terms of the legacy of liberal democracy, in terms of our own ideas about justice, ideas about rights, and how we ended up in this moment. One of the books that often comes into mind when we're thinking about this changing nature of American power is Farid Zakaria's book, The Post-American World and the Rise of the Rest, which got its fame after President Obama was seen holding the book. one of the reasons I find the book interesting is how Africa makes a very short entrance into Zakaria's framework, in that he evokes the Anglo-Boer War to make the case that the Anglo-Boer War was the moment in which Britain was losing its power in terms of engaging in a war that was reckless and really a waste of time and life, of course. And the comparison that he attempts to make there is how the war on terror, specifically the war in Iraq, has been a blunder for US power and an indicator of its changing place in international relations. Perhaps just to zoom in, I wondered, Prof. Mamdani, in terms of Obama's own legacy, and so thinking about this Clinton machine, I'm wondering, could the first African-American president shifted the terrain in a different way? Why was it that the Obamas could not have supported the project that Bernie Sanders represented? And had they done that, could we have had a different result if the nominee of the Democratic Party was different? Could we have had a different conversation about the US? And I'm also, the second question is around how do we make sense of what is happening in the US, what is happening in Britain, without focusing on the gaze of the Westerners and their own anxieties? How do we center Africans in this conversation? I think maybe let me stop there for now.
Any reaction?
Okay, thank you. Two very interesting questions. If you go back to the point when Obama becomes president and he appoints his cabinet and his sort of major leaders in key positions, whether in defense or in economic positions. One of the things striking about it was that Obama, who came to power at the head of a movement, Obama's great contribution was that the generation which had lost interest in politics after the Vietnam War thought of politics as a dirty game, in a sense. He brought these people back into conventional politics and gave them the belief that you could change things in politics. But the minute he became president, he lost steam. Every major appointment of his in defense was from the Bush team, and in the economy was from the Clinton team. Even his own chief advisors, Axel Lord, et cetera, were nowhere in sight. So Obama, in a way, to me, is testimony that American power is not the president. I mean, this is a juggernaut, right? Obama was, at best you can say he was a prisoner. At worst you can say he was a willing prisoner.
Sure.
Because you just look at it, you know, with the policing of communities of color, with the deportation of Mexicans across the border, with the changing of warfare to developing, operationalizing nuclear weapons or drone hits 5 times as many as under the Bush period. I don't think that Obama did not have the organization that you would need to shift the train. Second question, was make sense of Your second question is?
How do we remove
how-
the gaze of the Westerners?
Yeah,
And
how do we remove the, you have to realize, I came out of a 15-hour flight. Okay, I tried to sleep 2-3 hours, but I couldn't really. So here I am. That's why I forgot the second question. But it's the temptation is to think that we're coming to the close of a long historical era which began in 1492. Okay. And the shift of power is not simply a shift in power, but that it's not going to be simply a political shift, but it will also be a cultural shift, a civilizational shift, a different way for the world to be. But that's not a given, right? So the new rising power, China. Right now, the Chinese are giving us no indication that they are thinking of a new international political arrangement. Right? Remember, when the Americans became dominant after the Second World War, they brought a new political arrangement. The Americans stood for a dismantling of the old colonies, for formal independence, right, for the colonies themselves. Right? So the Americans offered something to the rest of the world. Right? And because of what they offered, they were able to mobilize that support, because the rest of the world could see a better future for themselves. Now, the Chinese have made it clear that when it comes to the economy, they're going to give a better deal to Africa. Right? They're building Africa's infrastructure in return for Africa's minerals, etc., etc. It's a trade. Right? And they're willing to do this as a barter arrangement by
Sorry.
must be me.
I think so.
It's okay.
Sorry.
Okay.
bypassing the shortage of cash. But what are the Chinese going to offer us? Okay, as a different political arrangement. Chinese cannot offer us a different epistemological worldview. That we have to do for ourselves. Nobody can give it to us. That was the point of what I was saying, is that we have to theorize our own reality. Now, what has Africa learned from the last Cold War? African leaders have learned one thing, which is you don't choose sides. Right? You play both sides of the drum. Right? You take the Ugandans, you take the Ethiopians, they are in bed with the Americans in defense policy, and they are with the Chinese in building roads and railways and this and that. Yeah. So they're playing both sides of the drum. But that's not enough learning. Right? I mean, Africa has got to say itself that this is the moment when, if they cannot think of a better world, we should think of a better world and put an agenda on the table and get them to respond to this agenda. Right? So it's an opportunity for us if we take it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think I will go to the public now and ask you to ask the panelists questions if you have questions. If there are any questions that you want to ask the panelists, please let's not try to provide the rationale and background why we are asking the questions that we are asking. Let's be short, precise, and to the point, because we don't have the whole evening. I think I will start from this side. I can see my brother here. Yes. And then I will recognize about 4 people and then go back to the panelists, and then I will do the second round if time allows.
Thank you very much. My name is Wadzonai Majetese from the National SRC. My first question probably is directed to President Mbeki, and Prof. Mamdani has spoke cogently on the scholar and the public intellectual, and I would wish for President Mbeki to then contrast that with the native intellectual cadre that has been a proponent of. And the second question is the challenge predisposed with the post-colony insofar as it relates to the public intellectual. And the deliberate relegation of the nationalist aspirations in favor of a more personal, self-centered apprehension that we see quite common today. And my question is to Prof. Mamdani, how do we then, as activists, engage with this crisis that we find ourselves in? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's give others a chance. Please explain the crisis.
Yes, the crisis. Yes, thank you, Prof. The challenge in the post-colony today is what you have defined as the challenge of the public intellectual, relegating their position as critical voices in society, choosing to probably sell out their intellectual capacities and for a remuneration or something. And that has developed a crisis in the critical voices that speak for the masses of our people. And my question is that is indeed a crisis, and in engaging it, us as activists, how do we then engage with such personalities that are emerging in society?
Thank you. Thank you. Can we go to the second person? The lady at the back with the black jacket. I'll come back. The lady with the black jacket, yes.
Good evening. This question is for our former president. Sir, you spoke of the evil of using generalized solutions for unique situations. And my question to you, and you spoke about the criminal force, the criminal institution in particular. So my question is that how do we as a society, when we have a reincarceration rate of over 82% in the country, now come up with solutions? And how do we as society make sure that when reformed criminals come out of these prisons, how do we ensure that they don't go back in such magnitudes of rates? And my second question is to the Prof. Prof, you made similarities between America and South Africa, but I think there's a bit of disparity between the two countries, where we are facing a 50% poverty rate. America's only facing about 14%, and their unemployment rate is less than 5%. So how do we circumvent the apparent economic advantages that most African countries see in South Africa, and also place in these policies, these migration policies, that balance the poor South Africans, which is apparent? I mean, currently we're having so many strikes from informal settlements, and from 20 to 30% in those informal settlements, we have illegal immigrants. So how do we deal with immigration and yet not base it solely on xenophobia?
Thank you. The gentleman with the white shirt? No. Shirt, that one. Not a white jumper. Not a white jumper, white shirt. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I only have one question to the Prof and any panel member that can answer me. I just want to understanding to say what is the issue between the Russians as well as Trump? I don't want to say Americans, Prof and the former president. I just want to have an understanding. Is it because of the changing balance of power, or is the question of saying that there's that metro populism, or it is based on liberal Democrat to say that is Russia really influencing Trump, or is Trump influencing the Russians? Thank you.
Thank you. Short and precise. The last one, the gentleman there. I'm not seeing any hand this side. Okay. The lady here. The lady with the duku.
The correct one?
Yeah. Yeah, allow him. I'll come back to you later.
Good evening. My question goes to former President Thabo Mbeki. President Mbeki, what have the African continent done to ensure that they secure a permanent seat in the Security Council? And what could be the implications if African countries decide to silently boycott a sitting of the United Nations? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll get back to you. We'll start with you, President Mbeki, to answer to respond to the questions that was raised, and then we'll come to Prof. Mamdani. There's no question that was directed specifically to you, but if you really want to intervene, you can come in. Yes, we'll start with you, sir.
Thanks. I hope the fellow panelists will help me with these questions, because some of them I didn't quite understand.
Yes, okay.
The lady, for instance, who spoke from there, I found it very difficult to follow what she was trying to say. So that's why I'm asking for assistance here, just not to answer the question, but to tell me what the question was. The matter about, as if I understood you correctly, the matter about this native intellectual cadre that we're talking about is a matter that Professor Mamdani was addressing. I think he put the matter correctly and very precisely. In a larger context, really to say, as Africans, we must think for ourselves. When he talks about we must theorize our own reality, in a sense, we've got to decolonize our minds. So you see, for instance, I see in our media here that people have picked up this story about, which originates from the United States, about fake news. So now something about fake news. And you know, the people in the US were making the loudest noise about this matter of so-called fake news. And the people who are the traditional producers of fake news. You know, if you take the Iraq War, 2003, and the Bush administration pushes this notion, supported by the British, that there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Who sold that story to the public in the US? It was the mass media. It's the same mass media which is saying, let's be on the lookout for fake news. the very purveyors of fake news for many decades. Now, I'm raising this thing to say, when I see this discussion taking place here, I'm asking myself the question, but why don't the South Africans understand that is a fake story? This one about fake news. As though it's... because we've had this phenomenon for a very long time. And it's being used in a sense now, or to say that the alternative media, social media, these are the people who are going to threaten us with. You can understand the reason for that is to deal with a competitor. But I'm saying that to see the capacity for us to think for ourselves is what Professor Mamdani was talking about. And hence to produce that native intellectual cadre who's been able then to theorize our reality. If I understood the question correctly. There was a question about criminals which I didn't understand. I don't know if my colleagues here understood it.
I think there's an increase, the reformed criminals. What about if criminals are reformed and then they don't come back? When they come back, there is no system for them to reintegrate back into society.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
As I understand it, that the question was about the need for a system to integrate former criminals who served their sentences in society. I agree with that. I mean, I suspect that as a country we don't have a very strong system which addresses that, but I think it is correct. Indeed, the very notion, when you remember when we came into government in 94, the argument behind changing this word from prisons to correctional services, corrections, was exactly this notion, that you punish a criminal by criminal serving whatever sentence, but in the process you help this person to be able to absorb into society properly, having served their punishment. But I think the observation therefore must be correct that perhaps we don't have sufficient of a strong system in the country to do this, but fortunately I'm no longer in government. I think we must ask the government about this. Trump, the way I've understood Trump is that Trump is an American nationalist, which is why he keeps saying America first. And indeed is driven by interests. Therefore, with regard to the relations between the Trump administration and Russia, obviously the question that President Trump would have posed to himself, even when he was still a candidate, is how does hostility towards Russia serve American interests? And clearly answered the question, it doesn't serve American interests. And therefore, it would be very good if we could have normal relations. It's a straightforward nationalist argument. Not because they'd fallen in love with Putin, but he's saying it doesn't serve U.S. interests to have this hostile relationship with Russia. Now, he then raises this question in the U.S., where there is this extraordinary phobia about Russia and Russians. It's the same old thing, the Red Scare in the past, when people would be looking for communists under the table and so on. This time they are looking for Russians under the table. There's a Swedish friend of mine who told me a story a long time ago that every summer in the north, July, August, those months, the Swedes would always have whiskey on the rocks. So I said, no, I don't understand this. What does this mean? So he says, you see, during the summer months, the whole of the Europe and Sweden are on holiday. So there's no news. The media does not know what to report because nothing is happening. So what happens is that always you have this whiskey class. This whiskey is a whiskey class submarine. Whiskey class submarine would end up on the rocks, get grounded on the rocks on the Swedish coast. That's whiskey on the rocks. And he says to me, you know, and it was always a Soviet submarine. Now, because this summer months there's no news, this becomes headline news. And the Swedish Navy goes out there looking for whiskey on the rocks. And never find whiskey on the rocks. But the reason it was being done was because soon after the summer holidays, the budget would be approved. So the military, they beat the drums about whiskey on the rocks. The Swedes get scared, and when the budget is approved, soon after, the budget goes up. Defense. Afraid of the Soviet submarines, which were never there.
Fake news.
I'm saying you have a similar phenomenon in the United States. I mean, this desperation, Mahmood, you come from there. What is this extraordinary phobia about the Russians among the Americans? They are looking everywhere under the table to find the Russians. The Russians are coming, the Russians are here. But it's part of, I suppose you've got to justify certain things. Yesterday I was watching the opening of the new NATO headquarters in Brussels. Huge, enormous building. 28 or 27 member states or something like this of NATO, they were all there and celebrating the opening of this headquarters. And you ask yourself the question, but why do we still need NATO? But again, the Russians are coming. So but that's the relationship between Trump and Russia. I certainly don't understand why the Americans seem to be so scared of the Russians. The Security Council thing, of course, the African Union has been dealing with this matter over the years, saying that the African continent should be entitled to 2 permanent seats on Security Council. But the whole discussion about the reform of the Security Council is stuck. It's stuck. It's on the agenda of the UN, but it's not moving anywhere. Because I think it's clear that the permanent members of Security Council is 5 countries which have got also the veto. I don't think they want to change the status quo. Even if, as was suggested, even if the Africans decided to boycott the UN for a month, it won't change anything. But this is a continuing struggle to transform, to change the Security Council so that you include the Africans. But it's not a matter that's entirely in the hands of the Africans. I think those are the questions I was asked.
Okay. Sipho,
Perhaps just to extend on the question around on the intellectual, that's the reaction that I missed in my first response. And the reality is that the tension between the universal intellectual and the public intellectual continues in terms of whom our universities value. Because the pressure to publish in international journals remains what is valued in these universities. And then I just, so that's one part of the continuum in a sense. And so then we end up reproducing the theory, because then what those journals or what that audience responds to is this continuous reproduction of this Western theory. And I'm wondering then, with this moment of student movements and the reaction of the university administrators, which has been excessive militarism, I wondered if you would comment on that, the fact that even the students can see the costs that come with doing work that is contextually relevant in challenging institutions, and even academics that do public work, that want to do work that is useful for our own communities, are continuously ostracized within institutions. So under conditions of austerity, under conditions of militarism, how do we theorize from our context? Because I do think it is an urgent question, especially for the previously white-dominated institutions that want to continue doing the same funding models, even though now the universities are majority black. And so when the bodies change, they come with different histories. So we need new funding models. The whole form of the university needs to change. And so if the project of the Colonial University was to produce respectable or palatable subjects, it seems at this moment to me that the moment to decolonize is also the moment to save the university. But how do we do that when the reaction is so forceful, it's so violent, and already it's seen in terms of students that are targeted in these university spaces? I'll stop there.
Prof, I think Sipokas has just added more questions to the questions that you got from the panel.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So let me take the question of refugees, migrants. I suggest you do one exercise. Make a list of countries in Africa. Forget about the US for the moment. Make a list of countries in Africa. Put their GDP. South Africa is at the top. And then make another column of the number of refugees hosted in each of these countries. South Africa is nowhere near the top. Right? There's a crisis in South Sudan. 300,000 South Sudanese crossed the border into Uganda a few months ago. There is no public outcry. Why is there no public outcry? Uganda is a much poorer country than South Africa. It's not because the Ugandan people are less xenophobic. They are less xenophobic, but why? It's not because they are naturally less xenophobic. It's because of an entire history. It's because the government has not provided the leadership in xenophobia. Right? Take South Africa. When the Mozambican civil war happened, there were lots of refugees which came in, and there was no xenophobia. Right? Why wasn't? The apartheid government had its own plans. Maybe they were hoping that some of these would become cadres for Renamo, maybe some other, whatever it was. But without leadership from the state, society is not naturally xenophobic. Right? That's my point. Right? So in comparing the US and South Africa, all I was comparing is a xenophobic leadership. Right? So that's one. Second question, I was interested in this question about incarceration because I think that we have to think of it more broadly. We have to rethink the very notion of a prison, because it's a very modern notion of a prison. Prisons haven't existed. There were no prisons in South Africa before it became a colony, right? Prisons came along with the institutionalized apparatus, right, that came alongside colonialism. Now, what do? You put somebody in prison, right? Which means you make it literally impossible for them to be rehabilitated. You remove them from the family, you remove them from friends, you remove them from any possibility, or you reduce their possibility to get a job once they come out of prison because they have a prison record, right? Instead of rehabilitation in prison, they become criminals. People don't become criminals. Most people, sociological studies are showing, most people do not become criminals in society. They become criminals in prison. Right? Because it's in prison that they meet others and they come under the control of the worst offenders and the worst criminals. They become integrated into gangs. The whole thing has to be rethought. Right? What the Americans call criminal justice, the incarceration regime, they will not, once cocaine spread in the white suburbs, the sentence is reduced. You didn't go to prison. Right? It was a misdemeanor. Right? So prison is reserved for poor people. The rich can steal billions. They're not going to go to prison. The question on the post-colony. Again, I want us to expand the campus. I don't think the problem is that public intellectuals are selling out. Just like people who commit crime, public intellectuals are making a choice from a menu which is no longer what it was 20, 30 years ago. Right? The menu is diminished. Right? So instead of blaming the individual, because that gets us scot-free, then we have no responsibility. We just blame these public intellectuals. Right? How do we broaden the menu? Okay. What kind of institutional change do we need which will make it possible for us to theorize our own reality? It's not just a question of an individual decision, right? You need institutions which will make it possible, which will encourage it. What kind of institution? I'll give you one example. One of the most successful experiences in decolonization of education on this continent, I believe, was at the time of apartheid. Think of Afrikaans, right? Afrikaans in the 1940s was no different from Xhosa, from Venda, from Zulu. Basically, a folk language, right? A folk language to theorize the experience of the Afrikaans people. You needed a whole set of institutions which they built In a few decades, they built universities, they built publishing houses, they built newspapers, they created an Afrikaans intelligentsia in terms of their relationship to English, they decolonized Afrikaans. Right? They theorized the experience. They theorized the experience of ordinary Afrikaans-speaking people. There was a terrible flip side to it. We know it, apartheid, right? But they theorized. They made it possible to they built an institutional structure which made it possible to theorize. Now, you tell me, where is the institutional structure where the experience of Xhosa speakers, Venda speakers, Zulu speakers can be theorized? Where is it, right? Afrikaans became a language of high culture, higher education, government. None of this can be said about the languages of most people in South Africa today. Right? So that's the real challenge, and I think it has to be taken up. The student movement, the student movement has raised the slogan, fees must fall. I think it's a great slogan, but I think it's too narrow, because the exclusion that the university represented was a double exclusion. One, it was elitist, and that was the point of the fees, right? And that's in the entire capitalist system, not just in colonies, okay? And I've just been reading, by the way, let me just say, I don't live in the US, guys. I am a full-time member of the Makerere University faculty. I spend 8 months of the year in Kampala. I am a part-time member of Columbia University faculty.